Hello everyone. I'm going to be looking at The Great Gatsby, and this is a screencast aimed at A-level students, and the title of it is Perceptions of Purity, the Fresh Green Breast. I'll be mainly looking at the coda at the end of the novel, and I'll be looking at how this theme of the quest for the Holy Grail fits into the novel and is actually quite an important trope that runs throughout. A lot of what I say today is influenced by an essay by Rebecca Platt, The Great Gatsby and the Quest for the Holy Grail, The Legend of the Fisher King. And I'll be looking at, in particular, at the idea of George Wilson, who lives in the Valley of the Ashes, how he could be seen as a manifestation of the Fisher King. And I'll also be touching a little bit on the influence of T.S. Eliot, the great American modernist poet who wrote The Wasteland, which influenced Scott Fitzgerald a great deal, especially in terms of his descriptions of the Valley of the Ashes. Now, to begin with, over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg kept their vigil. Why have I started with this quotation? Well, it's so telling because, for a start, as we can see from this illustration, the advertising board dominates the landscape. There's something terrifying about these eyes that bore into you. Now, we know that the landscape is a wretched one. It's a fantastical farm that grows not food but ashes. And Dr. Eckelberg is the kind of god of this. He's an omniscient person who broods over this wasteland, which is the modern United States. Now, this is very important because much of the theme of The Great Gatsby that's so powerful is about the absolute lost innocence, beauty, and belief of the early United States and what's happened in this material, marketized world that is personified by Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Now, I think it's best to look at it in terms of juxtaposing two landscapes. We have the wasteland, which exists in between the eggs and New York City. Now, there are some beautiful descriptions of New York, but later, perhaps, when Nick is more jaded, he will not look at New York as possessing the same degree of magic. Now, going back to the wasteland, the juxtaposition of that is the idea of the fresh green breast, which is the title of this screencast. And this is a vision that Nick has of the incredible beauty that the early Dutch sailors saw when they looked at America for the first time. And it seems to be part of the kind of idealism that exists at the heart of the American psyche. This belief that this country has magical possibilities, whether it's through the eyes of the pilgrims arriving for the first time on the Mayflower, believing that they will have religious freedom, or whether it's the Dutch sailors and the frontier men who see it as an opportunity to make money and to enjoy independence and self-reliance. What we see is the infertility of the modern world, and in particular, of course, through the figure of Wilson and his garage. Okay, the Valley of the Ashes is the result of the kind of consumption that we see in the eggs, and in particular in the West eggs at Gatsby's parties. In a sense, the Valley of the Ashes is a kind of rubbish tip. One of the things that you might want to say in your essays is how visionary Scott Fitzgerald is in terms of understanding environmental themes. And when we look at Wilson's garage, it is a symbol of infertility. Now, this is really important because there's an air of sickness and anemia. Wilson is one of the ghost people who populate the Valley of the Ashes. And it's no surprise that his wife is having an affair with another man, because effectively this sterile environment has rendered him infertile and impotent. Now, in Rebecca's essay, she writes about how we can see Wilson as a manifestation of the Fisher King. Now, this is a story that T.S. Eliot uses in The Wasteland. It's the idea that the king is sick, and as a result of his sickness, the land around him grows sick, and his infertility infects the land itself. Now, I think that that is a very convincing reading of the text, and one that can be very productive for you in your essays. Moving on now, interestingly, one of the titles, and there were a number of titles that Fitzgerald played with before he arrived at the Great Gatsby, was the idea of Trimalchio in the West Egg. Now, Trimalchio is a figure from classical literature. He is a slave who has become a former slave, who's become fabulously wealthy and is known for throwing enormous, lavish, ostentatious parties with all sorts of curiosities, etc., for his guests. Likewise, we can see that Gatsby is a Trimalchio character. His house lights up and has been deliberately bought to be across the bay for Daisy. He hopes that she will come to his parties, and he hopes that his parties will act as a magnet for her. Of course, as we know, the party is something that in the end, when she does attend, she despises. It's far too promiscuous for a member of the aristocracy like Daisy. Now, Fitzgerald himself wrote a lot about the Jazz Age, and if you haven't looked at this, students, I very much recommend that you read his essay Notes on the Jazz Age, because Fitzgerald helps to define and create that age. He and his wife Zelda are kind of party it people in that time, and this is where Fitzgerald begins his lifelong kind of attachment to alcohol that's going to kill him in the end. So Fitzgerald understands hedonism, and he understands that it is barren and ephemeral. One of the things about the Great Gatsby is the kind of theme that after the party there is the hangover, or in Gatsby's case, after the party there is the slaughter of Gatsby and the death of dreams, with Nick returning to the Midwest. But what I wanted to point out is that clearly Fitzgerald changed his mind about Gatsby's characterization, because there's a very telling moment in the novel when we go into Gatsby's room, and we've gone through this extraordinary palace that he lives in that has all sorts of rare books and music and organs and clothes that are bought for him by somebody in England. And then we have his bedroom. And I think the bedroom is meant to be symbolic of the real man himself, of the idea of the man alone, when he's not trying to project a persona. And what do we see inside? We see a brush and a photograph of Dan Cody. And I think if we expand that analysis a little, and we see that Gatsby himself doesn't drink, that Gatsby himself is very cool and composed, almost like an image in advertising, as one critic said. And I think that that's a very powerful way of looking at him, as a kind of constructed persona. So when he's alone, he's actually quite an ascetic, Spartan person who doesn't take part in all of this parties and drunkenness, or even in sexuality. We learn that when he was a young man that he grew to know woman, but he seems to have lost that desire. And really his desire now is for Daisy, who has become his holy grail. She seems to offer all the promise of whatever it is that he's seeking, and therefore, in a way, he becomes a kind of chivalric knight, fighting in pursuit of his mission to get back the Holy Grail. Now, we see in the party scene in The Great Gatsby something that is very interesting and that Fitzgerald puts in there. I'm first going to look at the middle of it, where there's a beautiful description of salads of harlequin design. So we think of a beautiful harlequin design, we think of the colours, we think of maybe the connection to carnival, to fun, pastry pigs. So you've got all this kind of idiosyncratic food. And this is the most beautiful bit. turkeys bewitched to a dark gold. Beautiful, beautiful phrase to learn for your exam and to be able to unravel and to talk about how this creates a sense of magic. Fitzgerald goes to great efforts to create a rhythm of magic in chapter 3 when we see the party for the first time. But interestingly, at the top of it, there's a clue that something is wrong, because we have this little contraption that makes the kind of orange juice, and it says here, oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of pulpless halves. So after sucking the juice out, we're left with this shell. And this is an image to me of consumption and of the nature of this kind of capitalism and the nature in general of the kind of consumer fetishism which characterizes America as the wasteland, the material wasteland in the present. Now, interestingly, there's also an unlikely parallel between Myrtle glimpsing a previously unknown world and Gatsby discovering a new world in Daisy Fay. In both cases, there's an element of money. And in Gatsby's case, although I've said there's an element of the Holy Grail, perhaps that mission of seeking the Holy Grail from its inception is contaminated and poisoned. There's a fantastic moment in the novel when Nick is describing Daisy's voice and Gatsby intercedes and finishes his sentence, and he says, her voice is filled with money. And we feel the allure there of consumerism. So in a sense, many times Nick tells us that Gatsby is an idealist, a Percival kind of character in search of his grail. We also have to question, don't we, the purity of Gatsby's pursuit. And I'm suggesting that there's a material and debased element to it right from the beginning. Now, interestingly, this description here is well worth looking at. This is the Valley of Ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat in ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. Beautiful sounds there. It's worth remembering, it's a very interesting context point for you, that Fitzgerald immersed himself in the poetry of Jonathan Keats as he wrote this, and he wrote it with agonizing precision, especially in terms of sounds, so in terms of the musicality of the language and also the rhythms of some of these sentences here. And so we have an extraordinary description which takes the idea of a kind of semantic field of agriculture and fertility and merges it with one of pollution and industrialization. And the effect of this is very, very telling. Now, why have I paused to have a look at that? Because Wilson is the man who comes out of this landscape. If we're going to see Wilson as a kind of Fisher King, a sick man who lives in a sick environment, we have to see him as a product of this industrialized world. We know that he's been ground down by poverty. He has a wife who utterly despises him. And a key moment in the novel where we learn why she despises him is when she learns that he has to borrow a suit for their wedding. Now, if I go back to Myrtle just very quickly over here, some of you may remember that what attracts Myrtle to Tom is not his hunky macho body so much as his patent leather shoes. It's the shine of those shoes. It's the wealth. So whereas Gatsby is attracted by the money and the voice, Myrtle is drawn by the shine of the shoes. In both cases, they're intoxicated with wealth. Now, Wilson, in the novel, after Myrtle's death, becomes a kind of avenging angel. When he finds out that Myrtle has been killed, all he can think about is the idea of his mission of revenge. But it is a very tragic mission because right from the onset, this particular Fisher King has been deceived. So whereas Gatsby looks for his holy grail, and we could argue he is deceived by Daisy, she often falls short of his dreams. We have Wilson now, who tried to go to the West, who tried to leave with Myrtle, but that was a complete fictitious journey. There was no West, there was no frontier left for them, and his wife despised him and would never have come from him. And then finally, we also have the figure of Nick, who is also a kind of Percival, who is in pursuit of a kind of Holy Grail. In Nick's case, he fastens onto Gatsby because he admires Gatsby's idealism. He sees this as a kind of having purity and is going back to the origins of the United States, which is fascinating. So we have this kind of triple structure of three male characters, each of whom have a kind of grail-like quest. Now, in the case of Wilson, as I said, he has been misled by Tom. Tom is the person who directs him towards killing Gatsby. And it is a kind of piece of genius, isn't it? And it shows how Tom and Daisy occupy this world in which they can manipulate other people. They're the careless people who can cause damage and then retreat, as Fitzgerald tells us, into their enormous wealth. Now, even though Gatsby possesses enormous wealth, it doesn't have the same kudos or cachet, and it doesn't have the same permanence. It's the kind of wealth that is very ephemeral and based upon crime. Now, moving on to perhaps what is the most important part of this, is the end of the novel. Now, I called this screencast The Fresh Green Breast, and that is because at the end of the novel, we are left with a Nick who is so different from the beginning. We know that Nick comes to New York filled with dreams of becoming rich like Midas, Maecenas, or Morgan. That when he looks at New York, he sees these sugar lump buildings that contain non-olfactory money, as he calls it, money that doesn't stink. The bridge from the Queensborough Bridge is always the city seen for the first time. So you've got all this sense of magic, etc. By the end of the novel, this is gone, and we're left with the dust. We're left with the careless people. We're left with what he calls the Holocaust, which is, of course, the death of Myrtle, followed by the death of Gatsby. But towards the end of the novel, we see that Nick also is in pursuit of his Holy Grail. And this Holy Grail is a recognition of the origins, or the beauty of the origins of the United States. And we are reminded of the idea that America is constantly seen as a city upon a hill, as a magical special place, as a new kind of Jerusalem that will offer not only economic and geographical possibilities to people, but also spiritual possibilities too. And Nick tells us that I became aware of the old island here. He's looking at the East Egg and the West Egg that flowered once for the Dutch sailors. So this connects to the idea of Gatsby kissing Daisy for the first time, and she flowers for him. And he says, a fresh green breast of the new world, clean, beautiful language which captures his sense of the purity of the vision of America that he has. But I'm going to suggest that this is a completely deluded vision. That the Dutch sailors who came to the United States were essentially merchants and not spiritual people. That they came there to exploit the land, and that perhaps right from the beginning, this vision of the Grail, once again, is one which is entirely false and entirely misleading, and that the Dutch sailors were the ones who began this exploitation of the land, and they saw it, if you think about it, here there's a kind of almost sexual imagery, as something to rape, take advantage of. which is one of the themes of the book. Now, finally, we're told Gatsby believed in the green light. Again, he uses a lexical item which is, completely filled with connotations of sexuality, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eludes us. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning. And he stops. He stops because he can't complete the thought. And he says instead, so we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Now that's a beautiful ending to it, because clearly Nick is being pulled back into the past. And Nick earlier is the one who points out to Gatsby that you cannot change the past. And Gatsby has this extraordinary kind of American belief that you can go back in time and rewrite history. And I'm going to suggest here that Nick is doing exactly the same thing. He has a vision of the early founders of the United States that really in many ways is very misleading. And he's anchoring himself to a kind of holy grail, which once again is an illusion. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, maybe Fitzgerald is telling us that you need myths, and that myths make a country healthy, and that in some ways having this myth is absolutely essential if we are to live in the world at all. So, to sum up, even though the fresh green breasts may be an illusion, and even though Nick seems to be making the same mistake as Gatsby by believing that he can go back into the past, perhaps Fitzgerald is telling us that that is necessary to existence itself, and that it lies at the core of American thinking.